So, Fauxlosophers.
Fauxlosophers.
So, let's continue our short series on Christianity. This week we'll be talking about the historical Jesus, eyewitness testimony, and the Bible. So last week we talked about things that Christians say, or justifications that they will often use for their belief, but now we're going to get into the real meat of the Christian claim, which is that the events depicted in the Gospels are true. You know, in a purest sense, if you don't accept this claim, you're not a Christian. You can call yourself whatever you want, but when we're talking about real Christianity, and at the risk of making a fallacy here,
all real Christians
believe in the events of the Gospels. Yeah. So, let's talk about historical Jesus. After all, if there was no Jesus, then of course the events of the Bible did not happen. The events of the Gospels did not happen. So, however, we won't be going too deep down that road, because virtually all scholars of antiquity, historians, agree that Jesus existed. Now, something important to note here is that just because somebody that we call Jesus existed doesn't mean that everything attributed to this person is true. And this is, of course, the case for many historical figures. For instance, pretty widely accepted Abraham Lincoln existed. But, well, I don't know about you, but I don't exactly buy that the events of that Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter movie are true.
I don't know about that, David. Abraham Lincoln was real, so that leads me to believe the events of that movie were also real.
Yes, that's obviously a historical documentary.
Yes.
So, sarcasm aside.
I get your point, though. Just because the person was real doesn't mean that all of it was real. Or anything that person even did was real. I think it's really easy to catch ourselves or catch others moving goalposts by essentially laying out a single, arguably, much easier to prove claim that a person existed, Jesus of Nazareth, and then using that as a justification to justify all the actions. Don't be wrong, yes, his existence is a prerequisite for those things happening, but, his existence doesn't imply that.
It's a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition.
Exactly.
As we would say in formal logic.
Yes.
So, now, something to mention, though, is that consensus does not mean truth. That just because most scholars agree that Jesus existed doesn't actually mean that he did. There are many proposals about what might have happened to create the stories of Jesus that doesn't necessarily require a singular Jesus of Nazareth to have existed. Maybe not easier, but hypotheses which don't deviate too far from the consensus are that there were multiple gurus, so to speak, who were spreading their Jewish wisdom and philosophy at that time, and stories kind of got mixed together, and they became a legend of one person who had these ideas. Or you have other people who believe that no such entity or entities existed at all, and that the conception of a human Jesus is actually a distortion of the original Christianity, so to speak, as Paul would have it, because Paul really is who started Christianity. This episode is not going to be going into all the different alternative theories about historical Jesus. That would take way too long. Probably would warrant a series of its own if we were going to do that. So I will say that if you'd like to know more about alternative hypotheses for Jesus' non-existence, you should look at the work of Richard Carrier, who has written at least one book, I think, and has done many very informative and interesting talks about his research about how the original concept of Jesus might have been like a heavenly being, and that all the events of the like the prophecy of Jesus were supposed to have taken place in the heavens and not on earth, and that applying those to the human Jesus are misattribution of the prophecies. It's very interesting anyway, even if you don't believe it.
That would be interesting. I'd love to check that out. But I mean, even in the plain sense, you got to keep in mind that the time frames we're talking about are so far back, and Christianity as a religion, as you said, was really started by Paul sometime after the events of supposedly when Christ walked the earth. And I mean, being frank, while I've heard a lot of people say, well, you can look at the incremental record keepings of each person who, had the Bible, because they were, thousands of years ago, these books weren't, we don't have probably the exact pristine manuscript of what it was. And that's assuming you even accept that there's one book and one account. There's many different of these things that, are of questionable credibility. But even though I've heard plenty of people tell me that, if you look at each transcription, there are so few errors because the people who did this at the time were they're professionals and all of these things, you got to keep in mind that it's really easy for stories to morph after the fact to suit the narrative itself as well. Like for instance, people love to look at histories and see how, so-and-so attributed, this event was attributed to this prophecy. You see this a lot in Greek and Roman mythologies as well, events being attributed to prophecy. However, there are, in those instances, you can take a look at like Plutarch, who was one of the historians. Well, he wasn't really a historian of his time, I guess you could say, but he's a considerably used source for a historical record, has a certain way of telling things, and there were others, like Dio, who had a much more lavish way of explaining things. And then we even have some records of the events as they took place, like in journals and diaries, where the events are totally different. But because when you're writing about something in the moment, you're just recording it as data. You can't know what other events are going on, so you can't attribute it. It's only when you gain that third person perspective over the entire narrative can you really start to make some of these claims make a lot of sense. And I think what's lost on many people who study the Bible in your average Sunday school, or even if you just take it on as light reading, air quotes, it's easy to forget that this isn't one just contiguous story from one perspective. So that's, I think, where we will see some delineation from people who tend to have differing opinions than us. I've talked with a lot of people who hold the belief in the historical Jesus and try to ascribe to him all of the things that happened in their the recordings of the Gospels, and the way they speak about it is very differently from the way it's actually represented in a historical structure. So I just wanted to kind of make that note when it comes to historical Jesus, is that try to remember the perspective from which we're coming to look at this is one not from a strict narration, but looking at the meta-narrative of how it's all, all of the collaborative works put together, and then the people who wrote those accounts, which tells a different story, and that's why I think if you want to have the complete look on it, that's why I'm interested in looking at, what was the gentleman's name?
Richard Carrier.
Richard Carrier. I'm sure we'll link something in the below to
Sure.
about him.
Or Richard, typical spelling, Carrier, like the word carrier, one who carries. So easy to find.
Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll let you go on.
Okay, so as we've established that even granting the existence of a historical Jesus, it doesn't mean that the stories about him are true. And so that leads us into the reliability of eyewitness testimony, upon which basically all trust in the Gospels is based. That we can trust the eyewitness testimony of the authors because they had no reason to lie, etc., etc. So let's even grant that the authors of the Gospels were completely honest. They were not up to anything. They weren't conspiring or anything like that. They really said what they believed. Okay. Memory is not as reliable as people tend to think that it is. And it's unsettling to question one's own memory. After all, it's basically all you've got for operating in the world. If you're confronted with a situation, you consult your memory to figure out how to deal with it. Or if you are trying to tell an entertaining or informative story, you're relying on your memory. But you're going to start to get details wrong, and sometimes you can get very, very important things wrong. So I'd like to defer some technical and scientific explanation to a study that was thoroughly explained in one of the good TED Talks before they turned highly political and expressed biases. But there are still a few good TED Talks to be found, and this one was entitled "How Reliable Is Your Memory?" And I believe the person who gave the talk is actually an investigator or maybe an attorney, but I don't want to say that with confidence. But who investigated a case or has investigated multiple cases of false convictions. Particularly the one that she explained was a false conviction of rape, which is a pretty serious thing to be convicted of. But the way that it happened was because the victim, who was actually raped, was shown a number of photographs of potential suspects, and one of them was of a man who was riding with his fiancée, I believe, at the time, in a car similar to the one reported of the offender, and he sort of looked similar to the offender. And so the police pulled him over, and he became a suspect. And when his photo was shown to the woman, she said that his photo looked the closest to the offender. Okay, and that was probably true. However, by the time this reached the courtroom for her to give her testimony, she said, "I have no doubt in my mind that that is my rapist." And now, you could say part of that probably has to do with the prosecution wanting to get her to give a convincing testimony. If you say, "Well, yeah, I'm kind of sure it was him," that's not exactly the thing that you want to say in a courtroom if you're looking to get a conviction.
Right, they're going to coach you through that 1,000 times before you ever sit on a stand in front of anybody. She knows what all the questions are going to be asked of her by the prosecution, and anyone who's ever been unfortunate enough to have been a part of a legal proceeding like that knows that during any kind of questioning where you're under oath, you get grilled constantly by your own lawyers on what you need to say, and you reinforce those things so that you don't go off path. So
right.
That could be part of it.
That could be part of it. However, the thing is that it's like I said, they've run studies on this about how memories can become, or false memories can become reinforced by psychological conditioning. That it's very likely that she was being honest when she said that that she was 100% confident that was her rapist, because of the way that your memories can get warped when put under pressure and under psychological conditioning. So something else that happens, and I'm sure a fair number of our listeners may have experience with this, is people who are said to have repressed memories that end up surfacing under the pressure of a psychiatrist. And a lot of these so-called repressed memories have actually been demonstrated to be false memories. And indeed, there was a big outcry amongst psychiatrists who specialized in supposedly uncovering repressed memories because they feared that the conclusions would put them out of business because they would no longer be able to legally convince people that they had experiences that they didn't really have. And normally these were somewhat innocuous false memories that were being impressed on people, like you were attacked by an animal as a child.
And that explains why you don't like the color red.
Right,
or something like that.
Something like that.
Here is the source of your trauma, therefore now we can address this trauma, and by addressing it, make you feel better or better.
Right.
Typical, like kind of a Freudian school on how to do things, I guess.
Sure. And so, and there are now well documented ways in which you can impress false memories upon people with given the right circumstances. Some people can be immune to it. I mean, no one is totally immune to it, but people who are sufficiently skeptical of things and can think more carefully, but everyone is at least a little bit vulnerable to this.
To inception, essentially.
Right. So an interesting manifestation of this that has happened in pop culture is known as the Mandela effect, which is really just a fancy name for false memories, but
it's popular false memories.
Well, right. So the popular one that I know of, and probably a lot of our listeners know of, is the classic case of the Berenstain Bears.
Or is it?
So yeah, we all grew up watching the Berenstain Bears, right?
Right. Well, take a moment and pause this podcast and write down and spell out the Berenstain Bears, and then unpause the podcast for our results.
So the Berenstain Bears never existed. They're called the Berenstain Bears, spelled with an AIN at the end, and it's so when I found out about this, I was not surprised. I remembered them being called the Berenstain Bears, but
I was surprised by it when I figured it out.
Well, but what's interesting though is I remember when watching the Berenstain Bears, I remember whatever adult was showing the show to me, calling them the Berenstain Bears. But at some other point in my childhood, I'd heard enough people call them the Berenstain Bears that I started calling them that. And then in my head, the spelling had changed appropriately as well. And then I was reminded, oh, it's really the Berenstain Bears, and it's spelled with an A, not an E.
Right.
So, but there are some people who are so deeply taken aback by this that they have developed a conspiracy theory that they're, well, maybe not a conspiracy theory, but some sort of woo-woo
I think conspiracy theories.
I guess so.
Adequate.
That they have been somehow warped into an alternate universe because they come from the real universe where it was the Berenstain Bears, and this is all some kind of trick. And this is somehow proof of like the many worlds theory and things like that.
The worlds intersected at one point, and half the people in the world lived in a universe where Mandela died in jail, and apparently the Berenstain Bears was spelled Berenstain, but the rest of us were not. And
right.
So apparently David and I are from different dimensions, because I never remember it called the Berenstain Bears. Yeah. I wonder how many people we lost just now to go actually look it up to see, is it really? Please come back.
Please come back and no, you're not in an alternate reality, as far as we know.
As far as we know. More on that next week.
Oh,
anyway.
Don't set me up for that. So anyway, the point is that memories can be altered through experiences, through intentional psychological conditioning, or through cultural phenomena, and probably in many other ways as well. In fact, I recall being told at one point that it's been, I don't want to confidently say proven or demonstrated, but There is a hypothesis in neuroscience that each time you recall a memory, and I suppose it needs to be a sufficiently complex memory for this to apply, you remember at least a little bit of the details incorrectly. And upon each recollection of whatever narrative it is you're trying to remember, you will get another detail wrong. But I don't know how true that is. But this is a thing to be considered.
Definitely. Well, and that all kind of stems off the fact that we don't like admitting that we don't know something. And one half of your brain, anyway, has a really good habit of filling in blanks for you to make you feel confident.
Yes.
That's a topic for another time.
Yes.
Very interesting topic.
That would be a very interesting topic to go into.
But needless to say, have you ever, I've caught myself recounting a story in front of someone who was either there or whom I've already told the story.
And you'll disagree.
And that we'll disagree on something that I would have thought would have been really simple. And then, a third person will come in that was also there and has a different account, and you can't chalk all of it up to just a difference of perspective.
Or I think all of us have had some sort of experience where we're telling a story or a joke or something like that needs to be remembered in a particular way, but maybe it's a story or joke we haven't told in a while, and so we're losing some of the details. And you'll get part of the way through it, and then in order for something else to line up, you'll realize, oh, I've said something wrong in this story. I need to go fix that because then it doesn't line up right.
Exactly. And even the most basic one of these, last anecdote, I promise.
Okay.
I know, how I love my anecdotes.
Yes.
The last example of this is I have a childhood friend that, I love this guy to death. He's a great guy, but he irritates me to no end sometimes when he will hum or sing back lyrics to songs because he always gets them wrong. But he is so vehemently confident that he has got the correct lyrics. Even though we both heard the song 1,000 times, we will have differences in, one word here or there. And it's just a simple mix-up. But, and that could be just chalked up to a difference of perspective. But, I mean, honestly, if you repeat something back to yourself enough times, it'll eventually change, go all telephone game with yourself. And,
right.
So
establishing that, what are the things that we're really disputing about the events depicted in the Gospels? Because there's a lot of stuff in there that's not really all that interesting and not really worth disputing. But what is worth disputing that would lend a lot of credence to the stories is if the miracle stories were true. If there really was someone performing real miracles, that would be very interesting and very important to consider in making a decision about what to believe. So one thing that's interesting that it's almost a little bit too convenient that we have an example of something like this in the modern day. The late Satya Sai Baba. Are you familiar with that name?
Not at all.
Okay, so Satya Sai Baba was an Indian guru. He died in 2011. I think he lived to 81, so he was around for quite a while, and he accrued quite a number of followers who believed that he was a divine miracle worker. Even that he was born of a virgin, which is interesting.
It's very common, actually, in the deidical circles.
Apparently. I think it's been said that he's performed all of the miracles of Jesus and more. I don't care enough about him to look up all the miracles that he's supposedly done. And I've also heard that you can try to find videos of his miracle performances on YouTube, but that they're quite underwhelming. But he even though you haven't heard of him, Joe, and I hadn't heard of him until Sam Harris said something about him. He was at least well known enough that he had a birthday party, I guess, sometime in the early to mid 2000s.
Have to be.
Actually, probably closer to the late 2000s. But anyway, and 1 million people showed up.
Lord.
So, I mean, it's not like no one knew or cared about this guy.
Right.
anyway, so these people are talking about the miracles this guy is performing today, and or were talking about it at the time, and this is basically today. 7 years ago is not a long time, and so if in the age of science and reason and the internet, we have people talking about someone performing such miracles in India today, that I'm going to say basically all the rest of the world doesn't believe, and there's no real evidence to support. Imagine we set those back about 2,000 years ago, a little bit less than 2,000 years ago, in the pre-scientific first century Roman Empire, and the books about these miracles are not written until decades after the miracle worker has died, and then
Also keeping in mind a majority of these works also written by people who ascribe to the religion itself, people who genuinely believe them anyway.
Right.
I mean, I don't know this enough to say it with certainty, but I would be interested to see what the, if at all, more skeptical members of the time had to say. There's not a whole lot that I've heard of to be said about it.
Right.
From the time period either. So,
or at least if there was, it may have been destroyed, but that's beside the point.
Right, but like the same thing with the guy you mentioned from today. If I heard his testimony from any of these people, then I locked it in a time capsule for 1,000 years and it pops out the other end. You lack the context of the time to really judge the writer, of which we know even less about than the supposed historical Jesus. So
right. Yeah, that's exactly right. So with that in mind, if that can happen today, then taking into account that context, I submit that the existence of writings about these miracles is not sufficient evidence to believe that they actually occurred. That it is apparently very easy for such stories to crop up and be believed by many people.
I would also offer a point to say that I think most fundamentalist Christians would tend to agree with us if it were any other book of miracles or a historical account as well. See, we're making the sweeping, we are talking about Christianity right now, but that's a pretty sweeping generalized claim. I don't think that any real miracles have existed in any historical, retelling that's been taken from word of mouth to scroll to tome to book to the modern age and a weblog. I don't believe that any of those. And I think, just in the logical camp's sake, without trying to invoke a fallacy, I think it's a lot easier to claim that none of them are real than to selectively claim each are real.
Right.
As well. And so that's one thing I would also pose to those who would have a disagreement on that edge is I would want to know what they have to say about, what makes your slice of miracle records from thousands of years ago true, as opposed to, anything that happened in the Hindu religion, anything that happened in Buddhism, which goes as far back as well, and I'll save the rest for the last part.
So. To close off miracle stories, I'm going to shamelessly paraphrase Sam Harris and what he had to say about it. And we should provide a link to the original quote as well. That if we consider the miracle stories of Satya Sai Baba and the apparently millions of followers he has, if 1 million people showed up to his birthday party, we can imagine there are more who couldn't make it. They don't warrant an hour on the Discovery Channel. Okay, but if we take similar stories about Jesus and we, as stated before, set them a couple of millennia ago in the pre-scientific Roman Empire, and have them written decades after his death, then half the world today considers it a legitimate project around which to base our lives.
Right. I'd like to point out one other thing, if that's okay.
Sure.
I had hinted on this. I can't remember if it was last week. In one of these episodes, we're getting to the point where they're all starting to blur together because human memory, it's fallible.
Yes.
I had brought up the human context of tradition and the allure of I call them like legacy stories or items, mythical things.
Legends.
Legends, yeah. I don't know what the human preponderance is with these things.
We do seem to have a fascination with things that are old, especially stories that are old.
Yes, and I don't know if it's because we admire the fact that these things withstand or have in their own way lived far longer than any human life. I don't know if it stems from our fascination with our own mortalities or what. But yeah, I'm going to cite another common, religion that's recent. The Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster, right? No one lends that any kind of legitimacy because it sounds ridiculous. The name's ridiculous.
To be fair, that was intentionally ridiculous.
I know, but, most people, for instance, I'll even take the name Jesus. That holds reverence today in most of the circles that practice it because that's not a common name. That name isn't Anglican.
Right.
It's different. It makes it sound more mysterious and far distant. And the time even, that's a super common name. That would be like, praying to Bob of Nazareth. Most people...
Or, I think the accepted correct translation of his name is Joshua.
Right. Which is still a very common name.
Which is still a very common name.
And so I'm just going to go and lay it out there that the difference between, I'm not going to butcher his name, and Jesus... besides there being the time gap, is that you've got this OG cred that you've built up from all these thousands of years. That it's mysterious, it's far off, it's alluring, and it's almost as though, like when people go to a magic show, you don't really want
you're not going to a magic show to call out the magician and say, "Aha! I see what you did there. I bet you did this, didn't you?"
Right, or even to learn how the trick works.
Right.
You're
there to be impressed by the trick.
Right, and there's something to be said about that. And one of these days, David, I'm going to sit down and try to put together a case for that, and actually build that out. But I don't know. I just had to point that out again because it really does get to me that people cite the fact that this is ancient. And that should be a new type of fallacy. Instead of appeal to tradition, it should be appeal to ancientness.
Right.
Kind of the same thing, but
just a little bit different. Like appeal to longevity.
Right. Or exactly. You could probably come up with a better term, like appeal to infinitum. It's just always existed.
Right.
So that's why it's true. It's like, well, okay, what?
Right.
But I'll let you continue. Sorry, it just kind of grinded my gears for a moment to think about.
We're starting to get into talking about the Bible. So let's just jump right into the Bible. Why is the Bible held in such high regard?
Can I pose a preemptive question?
Okay.
Which Bible?
Yes, this is a good point. Well, I was going to talk about that at the end, actually.
Okay, well we can get into which Bible we're bashing at the end.
Right. Well, okay, well, I should say that the references that I intend to make will be valid in both the King James Version, which is apparently the definitive Bible, besides the fact that it has atrocious language that is difficult to understand. I was reading a little bit today and found I was actually going to use the King James to make my references today, and oh goodness. I don't think that any of our listeners would actually know what the words mean, actually, in some of these verses.
That's kind of insulting to our viewers, though, David.
It's insulting to me, too, because I wouldn't even know what it meant having read it. Without having looked at a different translation. It really is a different language. So my references that I'll be making today will be out of the English Standard Version, which is basically just a touched up King James. It's pretty close to the King James. but uses modern words.
And I will just interject one more time and say that of the many believers I've spoken to in the faith of Christianity, I'm sorry, I feel like I need to keep being more specific, getting over my colloquial terms. I have heard that they are often using that version in modern practice as well as what's deemed, at least in the community they all pertain to, or the wider spread community, because they go to different churches and are of different sects. That's a common modern accepted translation. So
right, it's considered superior to the New International Version, which saw some popularity for a while, but this one seems to be the most popular right now in the United States, so at least in the southern United States where I have experience.
Yep. So we're going right to the source.
Yes. So, why do people think the Bible is special? Well, so the first reason that people really tend to give it credence is its prophecies that it contains. That if you can predict the future, you must you must know a thing or two about either the universe or be in communication with the creator of the universe, if there is one. That's the narrative being given here. So let's talk about prophecy and the problems with prophecy. Specifically, the prophecy in the Bible. So one thing about them is that most of them, especially the ones that pertain to the events leading up to Jesus, they're really vague. In fact, I'll turn to my Bible now to Luke chapter 7, verse 27, in which Jesus says, referring to John, "This is he of whom it is written, Behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way before you." Okay, so I'll read that again. "Behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way before you." How many things could that possibly mean? There will be a messenger before an event. Okay. We could apply that to anyone who gave news of a coming anything. This is not a particularly exciting prophecy, and so a lot of these are vague, and indeed even newspaper and magazine horoscope predictions are more specific than this. This is supposed to be the best that the omniscient creator of the universe can do, because apparently that's who inspired that prophecy. So I'm personally not impressed, and I think we need to consider the validity of prophecies. Now, I will certainly be accused of cherry picking, having only brought up one.
I was actually going to accuse you of cherry picking,
yes,
just to keep you honest.
Yes. You're not entirely wrong. There are some other prophecies, let's say in Psalms especially, because David is supposed to be the analog of Jesus, and so David wrote a bunch of psalms that have to do with the events of Jesus' life as described in the Bible, or in the Gospels, I mean. But the problem with that is that both the authors of the Gospels, as well as Jesus himself, who was supposed to be a Jewish scholar, would have advanced knowledge of which prophecies Jesus was supposed to fulfill. A prophecy is not very impressive if the person who is supposed to fulfill the prophecy knows exactly what he is supposed to do in order to fulfill them. It's not like this is an impartial goodness. What is the word for someone who speaks prophecy? Prophet.
Yeah, I was like,
for some prophet to proclaim his prophecy and then for the events to unfold without any interference at all.
Right. At that point, prophecy kind of honestly just kind of becomes like setting criteria out. And it's funny because even in, I'm not going to go quote scripture on you, but when people look for something that fulfills a prophecy as a way to ascribe a title or a definition to somebody, which that's essentially what Christianity did. Christianity, in many ways, is like the fulfillment of Judaism. The Messiah has returned. Now we can move forward. Modern day Orthodox Jews don't believe that. They believe, no, we're still waiting for him. Whatever. Not going to get into that whole schism. Mm-hmm. But when it just lays out the rubric, essentially it's to anyone else today, it'd be no different than me saying, oh well, if you can do the following 5 things, then you are this person. That's your proof.
Right.
And it's not like in some ways it could be like issuing a challenge to somebody, but it's much different when.
Well, that is basically what it turns into. It just becomes a challenge. Whoever can manage to pull off all these things that were said about this person can be said to be that person.
Right. So that's all I had to say about it.
Right. So and it might have been impressive enough for someone like Jesus to carry out everything that he was supposed to do in order to meet the prophecy. But what's a lot less impressive and highly likely, given the time frame in which the Gospels were written, that the authors, with available references to these prophecies, could fill in the blanks where the real events didn't line up as they were supposed to, and I failed to prepare adequately for this specifically, because there are cases where if you look at the Gospels in the order that they were written chronologically, you'll see that more details get added in over time to fill in more prophecies. That the oldest Gospel stories leave out things that the later ones mention, which is suspect. So another thing is that another thing about the Bible is that it is supposed to be the revelation of the Word of God. That God's intent is given to a person who writes it down, and this becomes part of the Bible. Here's the problem with revelation. If you have for yourself a genuine experience of revelation, then nobody can really deny you that, right? Because I wasn't in your head when that happened. I don't know what you experienced. And I can't tell you that you didn't have an experience. But if I come to you and say, I had this revelation, God says you need to sell your house and give your children up for adoption, and with all the money, you need to buy as much popcorn as you possibly can and bury it where your backyard once was because you just sold your property. Okay, and then the world's problems will be solved. Okay. Now, you can't deny me my revelation because you weren't there, you don't know what experience I had. But as far as you're concerned, all I've told you is hearsay. You have to take me at my word that it really was the creator of the universe who told me that. And then, if you for some reason believe this and tell somebody else, then it's hearsay upon hearsay. And that's really what revelation comes down to, is that in a case of genuine revelation, sure, the person to whom it was revealed has their knowledge, but that's not sufficient reason for someone else to believe that person. And this seems to me to be an important apparent failure on the part of the biblical God, who apparently wants us to know about these things, but requires us to accept the hearsay of others rather than telling us himself. But more on that later. Do you have anything to say about Revelations?
I mean, I guess one of the biggest things to me, like you said, it's just you taking someone else at their word at that point, which does seem kind of lazy for somebody who could just make it apparent to anybody,
Right.
everybody.
Well, and someone who not only could make it apparent to you, but apparently has motivations for doing so.
Right.
Because he wants us to know him.
Apparently.
Well,
and that's another thing about it too. I feel like, I don't know, this is pretty unsubstantiated, but I'm going to say it anyway because it's just my thought on the matter. I feel like a lot of what the scripture is that it contains revelations are really convenient. Let me put it that way. If they were a human machination, they're incredibly convenient. And not only that, and I'll say they're convenient because they're essentially, all revelations are appeals to authority if they're not true, or regardless of whether they're true or not.
whether they're true or not.
You're appealing to someone else, and it says nothing about who you are. Because an ideal revelation, it shouldn't matter who the source is, as long as you believe the authority that's been cited.
Mm-hmm.
So that's wildly convenient for anybody who's citing the revelation, because you can't disprove it. You essentially are taking a gamble at that point, based on your belief system.
Right.
Secondly, something else that really strikes me as interesting is, back to it all being convenient, is whether or not you should believe them is the integral part of why they call it the faith. Why should you believe someone who has a revelation? Because you should believe them.
Right.
That's the core argument. It's excellently constructed circular logic in such a way that, someone has a revelation. God told me this, or God showed me this, so therefore, and then lays out either a command, a story, something to influence the masses of the people who tend to believe this thing. Well, say, David, you told me to sell all my possessions, give all my kids up for adoption, take all the money I made, buy popcorn, and bury it in my backyard. Okay? Why should I believe you? You should...
Because God told me.
Exactly. Because it's a revelation, and because you should, And don't get me wrong, plenty of people will go on to say, well, what about, what if you're wrong? Hell, all this stuff. We're not going to get into all that right now, but I'm just saying,
not right now.
Looking at it in the Bible, it forms an excellent cyclical cycle, and it's all man-made.
Cyclical cycle, that's a little bit redundant.
Exactly. That's the joke. I intentionally was brilliant. And also intentionally sarcastic, apparently. Sorry, I apologize. It's anyway, but yeah, that you can see it laid out in a circle. It's all there. It's like chains all the way through the Bible of different revelations being revealed, acts that then come out of that, and then it's constant course corrections by people. And that's another thing too. No one claims that God literally wrote the Bible.
Well, some people do, but those people are ignorant.
Sure, but I would say that most fundamentalist Christians acknowledge that it's literally handwritten by men.
Well, and indeed, I mean,
Inspired by God.
A lot of the books in the Bible are named after those who allegedly wrote them.
Right. And don't get me wrong, they may say, but even then, the authority that the book holds it's in itself a revelation, because all of it was divinely guided. The Bible itself being God, being of God, itself is the revelation. So not only are the original claims made in the Bible as revelations, the whole Bible itself is essentially asserting its truth because it's all a revelation, because it's the divine word of God. God wrote this through the hands and minds of his people. So it's just this layer cake
Right.
of taking it on faith. That, like, really, that's what the Bible is. The Bible is entirely irrelevant to somebody if they don't take anything it has to stock in faith. I would make that assertion, and I think most fundamentalist Christians would agree with me.
Well, they would agree and assert that as a virtue.
Exactly, and that's the point. That's the core argument, I feel like, against it, is that faith is not a virtue.
Right, as we talked
Trust
about last week.
is a virtue, but not faith, as you mentioned last week. So that's all I have to say about Revelations.
So let's talk about the actual contents of the Bible. We've only sort of mentioned them. So one of the things that people will say gives credence to the Bible is that it contains no contradictions, allegedly. So, and that would be impressive for a book of stories of that magnitude at all to not contain any plot holes or contradictions, things like that. So the thing is that if you look for them, and you don't have to look all that hard, and it also depends on your translation, you can find contradictions in the text.
I'm going to go ahead and interject here. Also to say that commonly, whenever I bring this up, when the question of contradictions existing in the Bible is brought up, I often hear two things, and I'm going to just bring them up now because you may address them, and if not, we can go forth. But I want to, I don't want to say that I prophesied that you were going to bring them up and then bring them up later. The two things I commonly hear are, well, you're interpreting it wrong. So I hate that argument because essentially it comes down to a pissing match between who reads it right. And at that point, it's just down to a difference of perspective, which I often then end up saying, well, if I'm interpreting it wrong and it's uninterpretable to me, then what good is it? For some divine work of God, shouldn't it be easily interpretable to me?
Right.
And shouldn't it speak to me in some way? And then, the coupling with that one is, well, you're not reading it with the right frame of mind. To which I often respond, you can read anything with any frame of mind. And I could take, Alice in Wonderland as truth if I really believe it. And that's, there's your fallacy again. There's that same cycle. Well, if you believe it's true, it'll really speak to you. Well, no, I'm reading it to see if it is true. Oh, well, you can't do that. You have to believe it's true first.
Yeah.
I hear that. And then the second thing is, well, it's a collection of people who wrote it, and there are human errors there. But if you look at the meta-narrative of the deeper meaning, it's consistent. So there's two goalposts. Well, one, you either shift the goalpost on what do you mean by contradiction? Are we talking literal or, interpretive contradictions? And the other one is essentially an argument from anecdote, really. If you want to really get into it, is, well, no, you're just interpreting it wrong, or this is how I interpret it, and all kinds of fallacious things there. So
for now, of course, if we want to judge the Bible on its own merits, we need to stick within its text. So the contradictions which I'm going to mention are from the text to the text. That if you take all parts literally, then we have things that are irreconcilable. So the two that I've decided to mention have to do with just after Jesus' resurrection at the empty tomb. So the first question is, how many women showed up at Jesus' empty tomb 3 days after he was buried? Depending on which gospel you read, the answer could be 1, as in John 20, verse 1, 2, as in Matthew 28, verse 1, 3, as in Mark 16, verse 1, or an unknown number of at least 5, as in Luke 24, verses 1 and 10.
Sounds like a really bad game show. Sorry, but
and there are ways in which you could nitpick that so as to cover up the contradiction. But the way that it's written, they seem to paint different pictures, and also different things happen at the tomb, as is discussed in the second contradiction, which is who did the women meet at the tomb when they got there, regardless of how many there were. In Matthew, they meet an angel of the Lord. In Mark, they meet a young man inside the tomb. In Luke, they meet two men, the guards, I believe. Hold on, now I have to check. Pretty sure it was the guards. 24 verse 4. While they were perplexed about this, behold, two men stood by them in dazzling apparel. Okay, so maybe or maybe not the guards. Regardless, two men.
Yeah.
Two men, very explicitly. Okay. Or in John, two angels. So you can pick your number, 1 or 2, and then pick whether you want men or angels. It just depends on which gospel you would like to read. This seems fairly damning as far as that everything is internally consistent. That with the case of the number of women, at the very least, it's just intensely confusing, and why would these details be left out or inconsistent? But in the case of who they met there, that's fairly irreconcilable. Another thing that I failed to take references for is Jesus' bloodline has discrepancies in it. Not only in its length, if you want to trace it back to Adam according to the Bible, but also in its members. It's not like one is shorter than the other because some people were left out. It's that somewhere 1 or 2 back, it goes totally different directions. Of course, they get back to Adam, but they're different lengths and different members. That seems like that ought to be something that the creator of the universe and apparently father of Jesus would want to have right in his books and consistent. I'd like to point out that the 2 contradictions that I mentioned with references are contradictions numbers 402 and 404 in the Skeptic's Annotated Bible. So these are 2 of hundreds that are documented. Some of them are a little bit objectionable, and some of them heavily depend on the translation. For instance, I was going to bring up the question of who was created first, humans or animals, or humans or plants. These appear in different orders depending on if you're reading Genesis chapter 1 or 2, but it depends on which translation. In the King James, they are contradictory, but in the English Standard Version, they appear to have been revised so as to be arguably not contradictory. So we have a problem of translations here. But that's something to keep in mind. So in addition to contradictions, internal contradictions, there are external contradictions as well, which are, I'm going to bring these up and they are going to seem trivial, but put into context, they're actually kind of absurd. So let's turn to Leviticus 11, verse 23. This is in the part where it's talking about what you're not allowed to eat. Okay. But all other winged insects that have 4 feet are detestable to you. There are no insects with 4 feet. There have never been any insects with 4 feet. There's no evidence of insects with 4 feet. You'd think the creator of the universe, who just created these insects not too long before, would remember that he didn't make any of them with 4 legs. Like I said, it seems trivial, but if you're supposed to be the omniscient creator of the universe telling your people what to do, that seems like an important detail to me. Another one was in Daniel 8, verse 10. It grew great, even to the host of heaven, and some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. Now, to write this verse is to demonstrate complete ignorance of what stars are. And again, this is supposed to be inspired by the omniscient creator of the universe. Surely he knows what he made the stars to be. But he wants his people to believe that they are small things up in the sky that can indeed be thrown down onto earth safely and stomped upon. It's, there's a serious problem here. Now, of course, you could play the omnipotence card, say he can do what he wants, but we'll touch on that at a later time.
Or you can say that, oh, well, Daniel was writing this in a less literal way. That's another thing you hear a lot is there's a constant debate going on, not just between Christians of different beliefs, really, and Christians and atheists and Christians and whomever else, over which parts of the Bible are to be taken literally and which ones are not. And again, I go back to say that the way the Bible is often described to me by people who read it constantly or claim to is that it speaks differently to each person and that the Bible is only one half of the equation, that it needs to be perceived with the assistance of, other components of Christianity. They would say, some say the Holy Spirit or whatever. There's something else that has to happen to you first before you can even read it and understand it correctly. And all of this sets up this really impossible standard to... It's all a system. You take it or leave it. You can't take one part of it out. Or to them it would be claimed to be out of context. Anything that you've read tonight any normal person reading this Bible, by the way, any non-believer reading this Bible, would obviously look at that as some kind of look at these contradictions as what they really are, contradictions. But for each one of those, there comes one screaming in to the room that, no, you don't understand. And I feel like there's always an excuse for these things. And don't get me wrong, I totally would understand why there would have to be. Because there cannot be one thing wrong with the Bible.
Because if any one thing is wrong, then it undermines the integrity of the entire book.
It all comes into question. And really, in modern fundamental Christianity, the Bible is the entirety of the foundation of the religion. Without it, nothing else really matters. And it's held up as, and what I don't understand is like they'll print these Bibles in different languages and send them across the world to people who don't have anybody to guide them through it.
Exactly.
And claim that, well, God will reach down and show it to them. Well, why can't he reach down and show it to others? And I'm not claiming that he's real. And then there's there's a divine plan in place, or, there's always an excuse. And to me, this simply won't do. I'm sorry, but there's no real objective standards here as far as how you can treat it. Like, that's my biggest issue with Christianity. And I have this issue with most religions, to be honest. I haven't looked at them all, so I can't say definitively all. But one of the biggest things I have a problem with is, okay, how would someone who's never heard of this before come to this conclusion? And there is no answer. The only answer I ever receive is, well, there would have to be some type of divine intervention. So there is no way in their own conceptions of what this is that this can be wrong. And that's the problem with religion, is that they never can admit that they could be wrong. And I think that's my biggest problem with it, is the whole thing by its mere definition is nearly unfalsifiable.
Well, yes, yeah, it is
in their context.
Right, it is based on unfalsifiable claims, although I will call you out for painting with a broad brush about that everyone believes in exactly that way. Believes that they can't be wrong.
That's fair. I apologize. Fundamentalists, I would say then. I'll narrow my scope. Name me a fundamentalist who says that there can be something wrong here.
Myself, formerly.
Well, formerly, you're not one anymore. How can
No,
you?
but had you asked me that just a couple of years ago, then I would have been one. So this is still a counterexample.
Possibly, but I still think that counterexample exists in a state of cognitive dissonance. I don't think by definition, I don't know, I guess I would have to recant the definition of what a fundamentalist is to know whether or not they can admit
So
that
the
something could be
important
wrong.
distinction here is that I admitted that I could be wrong, but would have said that I haven't been shown anything at this time that would demonstrate it to be wrong.
Okay, I see where we're missing the mark here.
Yeah.
I'm talking about in the context of the belief itself.
Mm-hmm.
Take the individual out of the belief, which I know seems absurd because you can't have a belief without an individual.
Sure.
But the point of a religion is it creates a mold by which an individual can just simply step in and it all works. You know, religions claim to have every answer. You know, if you accept this, you never have to wonder about what's right or wrong again. You know,
Right.
really, like all the answers. They all claim, well, that's another broad stroke. Christianity claims to have all the answers, or a way to receive all the answers anyway.
Right.
And that's my problem with it, is this framework that it's built all hinges on every other piece being in place. In many ways, it's a domed roof. You cannot remove a piece from the domed roof or it will collapse.
Right.
They all rely on each other. And while I can conceptualize how that's a great structure, whenever you start poking at any place, it just simply can't be wrong. And I think that's my problem with it, is that the structure itself is entirely built on unfalsifiable claims. And therefore, anyone who believes it fundamentally has to accept that. And I guess that's where I was taking issue. And it gets difficult when you try to speak to someone who's a fundamentalist about it, because in order for them to even begin to enter into this debate in a lot of ways and really look at it, I would argue that it's really difficult, nearly impossible to look at it objectively when you're inside, because it is everything, you know. And they say that this is everything to me, you know. This is the penultimate of things that I do and who I am, my identity, and it's designed that way.
Mm-hmm.
I would argue that it's designed that way, and we'll get into this later, but regardless of who designed it that way, I think it's wrong,
Right,
to have it that way.
So the last thing that I wanted to say about the Bible is, and we've talked about this sprinkled throughout already, problems with the medium of the Bible. We've talked about translations. I've already mentioned where something might or might not be contradictory in the Bible based on which translation you are, and that's even in the same language. So translation upon interpretation, which you've already complained about interpreting things differently. Now imagine being a translator and needing to interpret things. You know, political influence has almost certainly been exerted on it at some point, probably mostly by the Catholic Church, and then also connected with the Catholic Church, but still affects all other denominations of Christianity. The concept of canon in the Bible, or the concept of canon regarding the Bible. There's no concept in the Bible of canon, but that people got together and decided this is the Word of God and this isn't, by a vote.
Hey, democracy, good for them.
And but not only that, the canon has been revised multiple times.
True.
Over long periods of time, where there were Christians, or they would have called themselves Christians, who lived and died by a Bible that is now considered false by all Christians today. And this is apparently the best way the omnipotent, omniscient creator of the universe decided to tell us about himself.
I mean, really, there's nothing to say to that.
Right?
Like, what can you say to that? You know, like, there's an old. It's not really an old saying. It's just this concept that, okay, you'd probably had to do quite a bit of research to even get this together tonight, right?
A fair bit.
A fair bit, we'll say. And these are just on the minor points, you know. I can't even begin to wonder if you had to version the Bible like a piece of software with the first canonization where they all rounded up and said, okay, everybody, this is the Bible.
1.0.
1.0, let's do this. What version are we even on now? Tell me.
Well, it depends on, firstly, it depends on the denomination to which you belong, then to the region in which you are, and then all the way down to the specific church. The specific church congregation of which you're a member probably influences which translation you use.
Or even your interpretation, potentially, that your clergy would tell you.
Right.
And then you bring up a good point that, you know, while we always talk about, while we have been talking about this, and I try to keep this in mind too, because I personally, anecdotal time, again, know plenty of Christians of various different stripes. I know you probably do too.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting to try to think about their headspace when you bring up a question like that. The question, and that's a really good one. I think that's actually really powerful to think about. You know, what about those people who died, living their lives according to a Bible that is not the one we use today? Can both people be right? Are they both true? Just not even knowing how different they are, just knowing that they're different, can they both be true?
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting to, and I don't often recommend this because most of the time you can't debate somebody about this after stepping into their realm and starting to make, you know, trying to use their own logic against them, because that doesn't really work. It's like fighting with fire. Like you can grant things as true and then defeat the next point or make arguments against that next point. That's fine, but you know, it's sometimes dangerous to say, oh, well, according to your logic, and then try to use their own logic to out-logic their logic. It doesn't work.
Right.
Ever. Don't recommend it. Wouldn't recommend it. They do that to themselves plenty enough anyway. They're pretty practiced. But what does that mean for them? Because to them, according to their religion, well, depending on which one you ask even, to some of them, those people all went to hell, and they are forever condemned and damned. But they did everything at the time that was right. You know, if you know...
Or maybe because theirs is the early one, they're actually the real church, and everyone today is damned to hell. And you know, because some folks over 1,000 years ago decided to
screw it up,
screw with the canon, which by the way is forbidden in Revelation.
Well, which Revelation?
Well,
at what point
the
did that come
canonical
about?
Revelation of John
Says don't mess with the canon. Okay.
Yeah, it says don't mess with that you're not allowed to add to or remove from the Bible.
TM.
Right. So by them screwing it up, you know, of course they damn themselves by altering it, but then they put it on everyone else who believes them.
Right. And that really, I think, is another huge problem with, I will say, religion, but Christianity we'll take out of the evidence we've laid out today. You, at some point, in reality, you end up taking a person at their word.
Mm-hmm.
You put your trust, not your faith, in a person. End of the day, you can say, I trust in God, I trust in the Bible. You started by trusting a person. And then if you trust in the Bible, you also have to have some trust in all of the people that revised it, wrote it.
All the innumerable number of people who put together the Bible that you decide to read.
That you've never met.
Yep.
That you don't know.
That are mostly dead.
And then not only that, but then you had to slap on top of that, depending on whichever else, the interpretation that you're given. You have to trust it. And don't get me wrong, I've heard plenty of people say, oh no, you're supposed to figure it out for yourself. Well, you can't, no one is given a Bible and said, figure it out. There's always, you're at some point in time, and before you can really call yourself a fundamentalist Christian for sure, you have to trust a person. And that's where my main issue comes in.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the biggest delineations between religion and science. The whole point of science is that don't trust me, just do it. Do it for yourself. Like anything that has been attempted to be proven in science, the reason we outline experiments, the reason we outline them in such excruciating detail.
It's not because we like doing things for the sake of doing them.
No, it's so that you can go in your backyard if you so choose.
Well, depending on the experiment.
But, okay, you can go do it. If you had the resources, you can go do exactly what they did, and you should get the exact same result within tolerance.
And if you don't get the exact same results, you win a Nobel Prize.
Exactly. Or you at least get the acknowledgement of those people that won't just immediately tell you you're wrong. Well, some scientists might do that. But the community in large is going to be more interested in verifying you first. Are you really right? They'll question you as much as you question the original people that you got into that with that caused you to do the experiment in the first place. There's no room for that in the Bible. There is no room for that. It's the end all, the be all. You cannot arrive at it yourself. You arrive to trust in a person. And that's my problem with that. And with the Bible specifically, because you, by trusting in it, extend your trust to all of the people. Like you said, the innumerable.
Right. So, now, slight objection that I predict being raised to that.
Go right ahead.
Which we will be talking about next week, is personal experiences. So more on that in just a moment, because first I would like to say for those who are interested in more problems with the Bible, ones that were recognized and written about before the scientific revolution, you should read The Age of Reason by Thomas Paine, which was written in the late 16th century, 1790-something. It landed him in prison at least once for having written it, which is interesting. Now, something to keep in mind, Thomas Paine was a deist, and so especially in the second part of the book, and I recommend you get the one with both parts if you're going to read it, he then pushes deism a couple of times. But, you can safely ignore that if you're only looking for the criticism of the Bible. In the second part of his book, when he wrote the first part, he didn't have a Bible to reference. So he got a couple of things wrong. But when he wrote the second part, he brags at the beginning about having acquired one so that he could go through every single book of the Bible and tell you exactly what's wrong with it. He did a very thorough job for not a very long book, actually. So it's very interesting. You should check that out. The Age of Reason by Thomas Paine. So, like I said, next week we're talking about personal experiences and morality. These are two very common arguments for Christianity. That despite any problems that have been pointed out about the Bible, which should really be the core claim of Christianity, as was mentioned earlier, none of that matters because I've seen God, or I choose not to acknowledge what you have to say because without the Bible, where does morality come from?
Or morality cannot come from anywhere besides God or the Bible.
Right. So we'll be talking about that next week, and that should be very interesting.
Very interesting indeed. I'm really looking forward to the talks on morality. Morality just rustles my jimmies real good.
Yes. Don't ever say that again.
I will.
I'm sure you will. So, anyway.
I think that's, I don't have anything to say. I gave a really lengthy state of the podcast talk last week.
Right.
I'm tired after this one. I want to do it. We should just pre-record it.
It's cheating.
They won't know.
They won't know.
I'll just put some voice
Well,
modulation
now we've
on.
lost plausible deniability.
I mean, you can cut this, right?
I suppose so. Anyway, so this has been Fauxlosophers.
Fauxlosophers.